Welcome to the Great White Brotherhood YouTube channel.
Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be reading chapter 6, titled Moving House, from The Path of Mankind. We begin. When we do anything that has any real significance in our lives, a number of events must occur. We are so used to doing things that we seldom really stop to consider the events taking place, and yet life is always following a similar course. For instance, we have discussed previously the life cycle of virtually everything, from birth to growth, to death to decline, and to, finally, what is termed death. Although nothing, of course, nothing can die. It seems normal for us to experience this because man, incarnate, experiences it all the time. We are surrounded by people giving birth, the baby growing from infancy to adulthood, the baby growing from infancy into adulthood, becoming old, and finally dying. So we seldom stop to consider why this should occur. We observe a similar event if we watch the unfolding of the four seasons of a year: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. How many people have stopped to compare these four seasons to the incarnation cycle of living things? And yet, the life cycle of virtually everything follows the same pattern: birth, growth, decline, and death. If we had the means to step outside of time and could observe the life cycle of a planet or indeed a galaxy, we would observe the same pattern. We can't imagine a planet or a galaxy being born, growing old, and eventually dying. But it is the inevitable cycle that all life goes through. The planet Earth, for example, we assume was always here and always will be. But there was a time when it didn't exist. So, how did it come into being? This subject has been discussed before, but we mention it again because to understand these life cycles will help us understand more about who God is, what the intentions of this force we call God are, and what our place in God's plans is. So let us imagine a time when planet Earth did not exist. Nothing can appear out of the blue like magic. So something created the planet Earth. To understand somewhat the process that resulted in the formation, the birth of the planet, it will be relevant to follow the process that creates a living entity, a baby mammal, an insect, a fish, or whatever. The process starts with the desire to create a new life. In the case of humans who live together in matrimonial form, one or both of the couple have the desire to start a family, as it is called. Long before that happy moment, the desire of people to live together so that a sexual union can occur is happening, and it is the desire to procreate that is at the base of this creative act. Of course, even in is what of course, even in what is called rape, there is the desire of one person to have what is termed sex. Now, we can see that the creative act starts with a thought, a desire to produce something, a baby, in the case of mammals and insects. Even plants have this desire to produce an offspring. So, can we assume that behind the creation of a planet or even a galaxy is a desire to create? If this is so, then there must be an intelligence that causes a planet or galaxy to appear. What is this intelligence? We have already mentioned the mysterious force that we call God. We have tried to explain that no one knows where this force came from, but we have also explained that this force, God, is alive and has self awareness. We went on earlier to explain that God decided in its desire to understand what it is, that it created, over vast eons of time, all that now exists. Further, We explained that God created 8 bands of different frequency, 8 carrier waves that would, ultimately, have life on them. And we talked about God creating planets in astral form on the 8th and the 7th planes or dimensions. We must stress that these planets are not physical but astral. They could be considered to be thought forms, the product of the thoughts of God in his desire, his curiosity, to explore the limits that life could go to as it too explored the astral realms. However, we stopped after we had mentioned the 8th and 7th dimensions and discussed other topics. But those who are themselves interested in esoteric matters will know that there remain 6 more planes of vibration to consider. So, let us now return to the 6th plane and try to figure out why it exists and why life is on it. The 6th plane of vibration corresponds to a certain part of the makeup of man. We should point out at this time that when we speak of man, we are not only describing humanity as it is thought of by the people we observe on earth, but also human-like entities that are in the astral realms and whose makeup follows vaguely humanity. We refer to some of the alien groups that are starting to influence life now, but humanity, being a complex multi-layered creature, cannot just be formed as one homogeneous entity. A large part of the makeup of man is spiritual, as opposed to physical, and a large part of that lives, if we may use that word, on various carrier waves of existence, created by God all those long years ago. So, part of man lives on the 6th plane. The question is, which part? We have mentioned that man uses a number of faculties in his attempt to capture the God force. The one that is based on the 6th plane is imagination. The fact that imagination is based on such a high plane, the 6th, should give some idea of how important imagination is in the makeup, the construction of man. Imagination is closely connected to the higher self, higher mind, and can work in conjunction with higher mind in a developed person. Earlier, we described the 8th plane and the 7th plane and tried to explain what it is to be observed on those planes of reality. Can we describe the 6th plane? The problem is that there is nothing to see in an astral, physical sense. No planets, no life forms, nothing that man incarnate could identify with. However, this imagination resides there. The imagination is, itself, difficult to describe because we all have imagination, and yet there is only one imagination, as there is actually only one life force God. So it is the imagination of God that resides there. Who amongst us could understand this concept? Not many, we suggest, and yet we need imagination to imagine what imagination is. Can you see the conundrum? We need imagination to visualize what imagination is, but we also need to be able to imagine just how it can be that there is only one imagination. So, the best we can say So the best we can say that the best that we can say is that the 6th plane is a storehouse of imagination, and that we all, as individual consciousnesses, can tap into that storehouse to take some of it when needed. Therefore, depending on the degree of development of our imagination, we are more or less in touch with that plane, the 6th. Now, imagination needs to be used carefully. It was mentioned in another talk that a developed imagination works in conjunction with our higher mind can produce amazing results. Equally, a developed imagination working in an unbridled sense can produce nonsense. We have heard of people imagining all sorts of things that do not and could not exist in any form of reality, but to the person under the influence of this uncontrolled imagination seems real. Mental institutions all over the world are full of people under the control of unbridled imagination. And these unfortunate people live a very sad life, as they are swung about in all directions under the impulse of their imagination. These people are totally convinced that what they create with their imagination is absolutely real, and it is very hard to cure such people. Further, as imagination is part of the spiritual makeup of man, it can follow them into the afterlife, and there are hospital areas in what is called heaven devoted to trying to cure such people from the domination of imagination out of control. It is true to say that none of us, or very few, are totally free of the effects of imagination creating illusion, and it is one of the disciplines that the spiritual path tries to correct, ensuring that imagination is based in reality and not in illusion. And yet, imagination is part of the God force. It is it is unreasonable to think of God as having a mental condition that would require psychiatric treatment. So, if God is completely sane and the imagination found in the sixth plane is that of God, why should anyone who is tapping into that one God imagination be out of control and require treatment? The answer is consciousness. We all have individual consciousness, as has been mentioned. This consciousness is itself able to think, calculate, and reason, but this consciousness has no means of knowing that what it is thinking about is true or false. Consciousness is the force that helps us create our reality, but of itself has no means to analyze what it is creating. The idea that God created when he created man was for all mankind to be in touch with, oh, sorry. The idea that God created when he created man was for all mankind to be in touch with the higher self, higher mind. If and when this happens, of course, there can be no falsehood because higher mind is God itself, and this must be totally sane. But the archons realized this fact long years ago, and so discouraged mankind from contacting their higher mind by creating religions that forbid people from doing meditation and from any action that would promulgate contact with the higher mind. So, imagination, which should be in contact with both higher mind and consciousness, acting as a bridge between higher mind and consciousness, does not do this, and so consciousness is left to wander about, influenced by imagination, which itself is not being guided by higher mind. Thus, perhaps you can see that the consciousness of many people is completely lost, as is imagination. This was the intention of the archons, who can step in place of higher mind, and influence people's imaginations and consciousness, not in a positive manner, but negatively, pushing people to act in the strange manner that they do at the moment and have done for many millennia, creating a topsy-turvy world where sanity is suppressed and lunacy takes its place. This upside-down world in which so many people live has been in place for so long that it is considered by many, indeed most, to be perfectly normal. We will not bother to give any examples, as a complete list of this craziness would fill an entire book. Sufficient to say that when a person starts to be able to think and act in a sane manner, that person would have to adjust every aspect of their life in order to get it back on track. The good news, of course, that, as we have mentioned time and again, the time of the archons is drawing to a close, and people will start to wake up to a reality based on truth and not on lies. So let us examine what this truth might look like when seen through the higher self, higher mind. The first thing is to realize that truth is a comparative program based on past experience and on belief systems. In other words, there is no one truth, but that does not mean that people have to use lies in place of truth. But it does imply that we all have our own version of truth that is applicable exclusively to us. It also implies that it would be incorrect to oblige another person to accept our version of truth when that person knows perfectly well that what we are expounding does not coincide with their beliefs and experiences at all. The great masters, excuse me, the great masters like Jesus understood this very well and advised us not to force others to live by our rules. The next thing that we should realize is that the law of mutual attraction is always at work, and thus, if we believe something to be true, we can always find others like minded. Thus, if sufficient people think the same thing, it becomes accepted as truth, and anyone who does not agree with that point of view is ostracized from society. It is in this fashion that religions, laws, and standards of general behaviors are created, to which all must comply. It must be said that if it curbs the excesses of negative behavior from a person or group, it is beneficial. But if, for example, it promulgates nonsense concerning physics or nature, it is not very helpful. Indeed, the incorrect understanding of the way of life is constructed is uh, indeed the incorrect understanding of the way of life is constructed, encouraged by those under the influence of archons, has acted as a brake to the development of science for many long ages. So, is there a way actually of finding truth? There is, and it is revealed in the degree that we can contact higher mind. It was mentioned that God presented man with countless problems years ago, and the solutions to those problems found by early astral man were fed into the God force. Thus, we can assume that God knows the truth about all subjects. Further, God is also our higher mind, and so our higher mind must have access to truth. This is where the sixth plane comes into play. The sixth plane is the plane of imagination, as has been mentioned. But in the construction of man, we find various areas that were designed to work together to allow man to realize who and what God is, and imagination plays a pivotal role in this process. At one end of the construction of man, we find the higher self. At the extreme other end is physical brain. There is a long chain of different parts to the makeup of man that should, if they are all working together correctly, feed truth from the higher mind into the brain so that any necessary action can occur. Next, in the chain from the higher mind is imagination. All truth issued on any subject by the higher mind must pass through imagination before being passed on to the next level. This is why imagination has been given such an important place in the construction of the eight carrier waves that God originally created. Now, what exactly is the role of imagination in disseminating wisdom to the brain? The higher mind thinks in terms of pure thought, pure concepts, but the brain is at home using images of various sorts, either words, which are images, excuse me, mathematics, which are other images or pictures. So, the function of imagination is to translate these pure thoughts coming from the higher mind into words, images or pictures that the brain is familiar with and can put into practice if required. The problem is that imagination has intelligence and can think for itself. Oh boy. It can create its own words, images, and pictures, and often does. Indeed, for most people who have not developed the ability to contact their higher mind, their imagination is all they have to help them resolve problems and find answers. But imagination, divorced from contact and direction from the higher mind, is rather like a ship without a rudder to steer it. So it pushes the brain of the person concerned to bob about in a stormy sea of astral and etheric thoughts with no hope of gaining control of its destination. The answer to the problem is to make contact with the higher mind. This can be achieved through meditation, but even then it takes a lot of spiritual training to persuade imagination to work in conjunction with and under the control of higher mind. That in itself is an understatement. Imagination, so used to thinking for itself, is not used to being the servant of higher mind, and it takes much dedication to the spiritual path to teach it to stop thinking for itself and to obey the directions of higher mind. But it can be achieved, and then, as was mentioned earlier, The person working with higher mind and imagination together becomes a powerful person indeed. However, the majority of people do not need to become spiritual or mental giants, and so the imagination does not need to be developed to the highest degree. The higher mind contains nothing but truth, and so any information projected from higher mind is total reality without any nuance. This is where imagination comes into play. In a really developed person, the imagination is fully open, and so truth from the higher mind flows into the physical brain undiminished. This could and would cause problems for many people living in a world consisting mainly of falsehoods, while their outlook on life would be at total variance to that world. I think we can understand that. This has been the trouble that many advanced beings experienced when they found themselves expressing one point of view when the rest of their nation believes something virtually the opposite. We should avoid this at all costs. Life on earth is difficult enough without expressing an opinion that no one else is advanced enough to accept. Therefore, we need to allow imagination to act as a filter of truth. This can happen more or less automatically if we control our imagination. Through meditation, imagination becomes, gradually, more open, allowing a certain amount of truth from the higher mind to filter through. The student will start to compare the new information filling his mind with information accepted by the general public. Should he express, when talking to his friends or family, that opinions he expresses is more or less accepted by his comrades, he is on safe ground and is rendering service by pushing knowledge along towards truth. But should he say something that is instantly rejected by others, excuse me, he should accept that he has passed the barrier of what he should and should not say. Thus, the student could, perhaps, stop developing his imagination for a while to allow the rest of society to catch up with him, or, at least, refrain from mentioning certain things. It is possible to meditate and develop other faculties without necessarily opening the door of imagination too fast. These other faculties have already been mentioned. They are called gifts of the spirit: clairaudience, telekinesis, clairvoyance, etc. However, the student should avoid mentioning these gifts, and certainly should not demonstrate them except to aid others in difficulty. Gifts of the Spirit come, primarily, from God, and God rewards his servants in many ways, but God also reserves the right to remove his gifts from anyone who abuses them. Let us turn to another aspect of imagination, often ignored, and that is the way art is used to influence people. We say ignored because the general public, when looking at art, observes the finished effect, a painting, a film, or whatever, and seldom questions from whence the skill to create all of this came from. It has been said that genius is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. And this may be true, but without the 10% inspiration, nothing artistic would be created. If one questions a true artist, they often admit that they do not know where the original idea came from. It just appeared in their mind one day. We have previously stated that nothing can appear like magic out of the blue, and so there must be a place where that idea was stored, and there must have been a mechanism that allowed it to be released, to become reality after much hard work. Now, now, we have mentioned brain, and yet brain is just a flesh and blood organ, operating by electricity and controlling the body. Thus, genius cannot come from that. Working in close association with brain is a spiritual equivalent of brain called mind. The function of mind is to tell the brain to operate the elements of the body via the aforementioned electrical impulses. Therefore, genius cannot originate in the mind. Okay, I'll break off here. This is halfway through the chapter. I'll stop here and continue on in part 2. Thank you for watching. All right, welcome back to part 2 of chapter 6, and we will continue reading from where we left off. So, where is the storehouse of amazing thoughts we call genius? It cannot even be the higher mind that contains all the knowledge. But genius, but genius, by its very concept, is creating something original that does not exist anywhere. Genius is to be found in the id. The id is a unique, meaning one, form of consciousness. There is only one id, and it is present, or rather, available to all. It is the basic pattern, form, around which human life, in all its shapes, and no matter what dimension it lives in, contains. There is just one id. It is not life. God is life. It is separate from higher mind and from all the various spiritual and astral parts that go to make up man. The id is different and part from all these, sorry, the id is different and apart from all of these things. It is not even collective conscious, although, I think it meant to say, it is not even collective consciousness, although it closely resembles it, and it certainly is not individual consciousness. It is a unique oneness that joins all humans together in a way that even God does not. Although we must recognize that id was a construct of God. So every single person, in no matter what dimension they live, physical or astral, shares the same one id. What is the purpose of id? As was mentioned, all is one, and yet it is clear that man is not an animal nor something mineral. God created all life, but the purpose of the id is to create the archetypal form of man to delineate it from any other object. The question is, of course, why should the id have anything to do with genius? The answer is simple, and we have already described it. All life strives to be the unique representation of God, as was mentioned. Man is no exception. The id cannot actually think for itself, but it does have awareness. The awareness, the awareness that it is the basic form of man. So, it also strives to be the one aspect of God, the life force. Thus, in order to try to become this unique aspect of God, it puts ideas into the minds of certain people, and they bring these ideas into the public's view. And we say they are flashes of genius. This is so that the id feels that it is closer to grasping what God is. It must be said that not everyone is capable of being used by the id to have an original thought placed in them. Pardon me. For many people, it is not in their life plan to follow the difficult and lonely path that geniuses take. However, it is said that everyone has their hour of glory, and so everyone can be given an original thought. Whether they choose to develop that thought and bring it into the public domain is a different matter. But certainly, everyone is given something of interest at least once in their lives. And so, the subject of imagination is complex and goes far beyond what people think concerning it. Indeed, imagination is a spiritual force that is closely connected to higher mind and, in many people, replaces higher mind, which can be both positive and catastrophic depending on which action is taken to set the wheels of creation in motion, as the person concerned allows his imagination to control his actions. Thus, we can see how important it is for people to learn to still their imagination and allow higher mind to pass uninterrupted through the layers of imagination and go directly into mind, allowing mind to be controlled by higher self and not for mind to be under the control of imagination. We turn now to another aspect of life known as determination. This word, determination, is greatly misunderstood. It usually is taken to imply pig-headedness, one-track mind, and so on. In fact, determination is quite important, and without determination, a person would be swept about by all the mass of information coming into his mind from a variety of sources. With determination active and fully trained, it is possible to achieve great things. If we look at mainly highly successful people, whatever field of activity they pursued, we can see a constant thread of a single activity they pursued from childhood until dotage. This is determination at work, pushing a person to follow a single course of action throughout their life. We must point out that determination should be used with circumspect, as few people live solitary lives, cut off from any family, friends, business, or social contracts. Should a person pursue his chosen course without regard for the feelings and desires of others, he would become the rather unpleasant person we sometimes see when observing a person totally encased in determination, following his chosen path regardless of others. Thus, determination should be balanced with a large degree of self denial. Indeed, self denial could be considered to be the opposite of determination. Someone who embraces self denial pushes aside any desire to advance for himself and puts himself at the service of those more determined. Thus, it is noticeable that people who have determination developed and push forward a single agenda often have one or more people that are at their beck and call, doing whatever the determined person commands them to do, so that the person is totally free to concentrate on his project. There are not only individuals totally engaged by their determination, most businesses have one determined goal. Governments are similarly enwrapped, although it must be pointed out that to follow any particular agenda is not the panacea of the problems facing a country and a population, but just the desires of those in power at the moment. Eventually, they will lose power, and another group takes over with projects opposite to the first, which they push forward with great determination, only, in turn, to be rejected by the voters when it became obvious that they too were pursuing empty dreams. In all cases, there is the determination of one or more people concentrating all their efforts on one single goal. As no one is an island, these few determined people surround themselves with people willing to subjugate their desires to the wishes of the few. In the case of a government, there would be the president, pursuing his agenda, various like minded ministers, and then an army of secretaries, lawyers, chauffeurs, down to the chefs and the cleaning staff, all beavering away to make sure that the desires of one determined person succeeds. Can we find in nature a parallel of this type of pyramidal pyramidal structure? Well, we find it in ants and bees, the whole colony working day and night to ensure that the queen ant or bee has optimal conditions to do her job, which is to produce offspring, which she does with total determination. We have mentioned ants and bees before and implied that it is, perhaps, not the best way for humanity to advance, and have suggested that it is similar to the Archon concept, which is to have a chosen few living in great luxury at the top, and all the rest working as slaves to keep their chosen few in the style that they enjoy. This system has, of course, been used throughout the world for long ages and was the basis of slavery and serfdom and carries on to this day in many domains. So, we have at one end of the scale people in total self denial, and at the other end, people totally determined to follow a course of action, whatever the consequences. We must also remind people that psychopaths fall into this category also, desirous of achieving a goal at any cost to others, or indeed to the planet. But we have said that times are changing and the time of the archons is coming to a close. This will mean that these hierarchical structures will crumble. But obviously, this must be done slowly and carefully to avoid the chaos that would ensue if this system was disbanded overnight. Now, how this will change how this will change of attitude how will this change of attitude affect those with determination highly developed and are convinced of the course of action they follow? If we remember that this change is a spiritual one, and that all humanity is actually one, over time, a spiritual change will come to determine people and, indeed, to those in self denial, and that will result in those with determination highly developed to start to think about the needs and wants of others. Equally, those who have subjugated their will to the desires of the first group will find their self confidence growing and will themselves start to develop the desire to create. This will result in a coming together, a joining of desires, not to push one selfish act forward, but the desire to act together for God and for man and create solutions to problems that will benefit all mankind. Just to finish off this subject, should anyone question, it is not our intention to interfere with the ant or bee population. Man has already caused enough harm to the bee population. These tiny creatures, ants and bees, have been created by God for a purpose, and we have no desire to intervene in God's master plan. The next subject to which we must turn our attention is that of motive. Why should motive come into the picture of the ascent of man towards God? Quite simply because we should analyze our motives for why we do anything. Everything is of importance in life, from the smallest action taken to the master plan of God itself. God has a motive for doing what it does, and as we all have the God spirit within us, it follows that we, too, must have a motive for what we do. The difference, of course, between us and God is that God concentrates all of his energy, if we can put it thus, in creating conditions where we, through our various experiences, help God to grow in wisdom, whereas we have many things that distract us and have more or less importance in our lives. Some of the things that we decide to do seem to have little or no effect on the unveiling of our life plan, whereas other things that occupy excuse me. I'll start again with that sentence. Sorry, I'm going to take a little drink of water. Thank you. Some of the things that we decide to do seem to have little or no effect on the unveiling of our life plan, whereas other things that occupy our attentions have life changing effects. But they all come from motive. So, motive is an important, if neglected, part of man's makeup. Can we find out where this object we call motive resides in the hierarchy of the human spiritual construction? There are some parts of humanity that we have not yet discussed, and we do not wish to confuse you by mentioning aspects of life that we have not yet explained, but we wish to give you a brief overview of the construction of man from a spiritual point of view. So we ignore the physical body for the moment and turn our attention to the spiritual aspects of man. These are many, and we have only mentioned a few. We must also say that each aspect of humanity resides in one of the 8 dimensions, or auras, although, as we have said, they are not exactly spiritual planes, spiritual galaxies. They are levels of spirituality, so the higher the spiritual level, the closer it becomes to God itself. So let us now, briefly, examine these aspects of man and state where they are placed in relation to God at one end of the chain and nadir at the other. God, as we know, is actually above and beyond even the highest plane, being the creator of them all. So God is outside of creation. We cannot create anything from the level of the plane where the creation is happening. We must create from a higher level. As we assume that God created all of the levels of man's growth, so we must assume that we must be less than God. And yet, we have stated that we are God. Once again, we have this problem to resolve. How can we be God and yet, if we were created by God and therefore must be lesser than God, be resolved? The answer lies in the collective consciousness, the id. We have mentioned that we are all one, and that one is God, and we are part of and totality of God. This difficult to understand aspect can only be resolved when we can accept that the thing called collective consciousness, that we term the id, is our connection to God. Now, we prefer to use the term id rather than collective consciousness because the latter can be manipulated by powerful minds, for better or for worse, but the id remains steadfast. It is our connection to God. Therefore, in the chain of spiritual progressions, we have the id, of which there is just one for humans incarnate, discarnate, and for those experiencing life in different dimensions. Thus, we start with the id. Below that, but closely connected to id, is higher self, also known as higher mind. Higher mind is our personal aspect of id, and thus our personal aspect of God. Each higher self is unique, and yet together our higher minds can join in an effort to push life towards perfection. Just below higher mind, we find imagination. As we have already explained, imagination can work with higher mind, and that produces what we term genius. It also allows someone to become a great spiritual leader. Jesus and Buddha immediately spring to mind. Below imagination, in the chain of construction of man, we will find the desire to construct either mentally or physically. Next comes determination, the drive to achieve a result, a goal. Then we go into the mind, which is the spiritual aspect of brain. And lastly, in this brief and incomplete overview, is the physical brain. But we ignored motive. Why did we do this? For the simple reason that motive is not actually part of the chain of spiritual constructs that we just mentioned. All the above mentioned aspects are firmly implanted in various dimensions, various auras, but motive is not. It is outside of those fixed attributes. Motive exists, but can jump about somewhat and can influence the person at different levels of intention. Motive can influence the higher mind to do wonderful, holy things, excuse me, or it can push someone at the lowest aura to cause terrible harm. And yet it exists, and one would reasonably expect it to have a home base in one of the planes of spirituality. But it does not. It flitters about from level to level, always trying to influence a person that is doing something correct. I'll say that again. But it does not. It flitters about from level to level, always trying to influence a person that it is doing something correct. It can be controlled and should be, yet for many people, it is motive that justifies their actions for good or for bad. Motive is the force that tries to persuade people to take action in whatever direction the person wishes to go. Thus, we have tried to impress upon you all that the invisible spiritual aspects of man's creation are real and indeed more real than the physical body and will outlast the physical body for a long time because the spiritual aspect, being connected to God itself, is thus immortal, or virtually so. It only disappears from view the moment that it rejoins God itself, and that is a long way into the future for all of us. And yet, there is a vast amount of energy spent by all professionals of medicine, clothes and furniture manufacturers, housing and vehicle construction, all of which is designed to assist the physical body, and quite rightly so, because man has the right to live in comfort. But there is actually very little effort made to help man understand and comprehend the importance of his spiritual bodies. The reason behind this has already been discussed at some length. We spoke about the archons, who were permitted to influence man during the time that the pendulum of life was in the negative part, returning energy back to God. We also mentioned that most religions and schools were created by and under the control of psychopathic people, themselves under the control of the archons. Now, we break off once again to assure the reader that when we consider the archon and archon controlled people enslaving the minds and sometimes the bodies of humanity, we are in no way criticizing them. We use the term psychopath in its medical sense, not in the understanding that has grown up today with all its evil connotations. All this dark stuff that went on for so long was an essential part of God's plan to return energy to God, to recharge the batteries of life, and so had to be. The evil that we would all like to have reduced, if we could have, was an essential part of life. We could not have the sweet without first tasting the bitter. So, man has been educated that all that exists is physical matter, and anything spiritual is just the ravings of lunatic people who were regularly locked up or killed if they dared talk about spirituality. Thankfully, we don't do that anymore. When we use the word spirituality, we are not including religion. Religion is an archon invention, and therefore was an unfortunate but necessary part of darkness. The life of Jesus is given to us to show us how the negative priests of Israel could not accept the light from the teachings of Jesus to shine into their dark world, frightening them as they saw truth for an instant. And so they did all that was in their power to shut off that light until, much later, other minds could invent a form of interpretation of the wisdom of Jesus that would please the Archon Master still hiding in the dark. Fear was and is behind any negative action, so fear has been created for all that time to allow the Archons to live in shadow. Truth creates light, and light chases darkness. We have mentioned that all life everywhere in our galaxy is now moving into the light, God's light, and is starting to chase darkness. We do not wish to labor the point, but we do wish to say this. It is time for man to start to move his attention away from physical things and start to concentrate more on spiritual things. There is nothing wrong with outdoor exercise, healthy food, and happiness, but there is a lot wrong with allowing sports, which are a relic of the gladiator days, to occupy such an important place in people's lives. There is a lot wrong with using drugs and strong drinks and even tobacco, unless used in a medicinal sense. There is a lot wrong with such concentrated thought on material wealth and objects. Similarly, there is a lot wrong with allowing politicians who cannot know how to run a country to do so because they do not have access to their higher self, which is the seat of wisdom. The way education is conducted is nothing short of criminal in many countries. All this exists because of the concentration of the minds of people on physicality at the expense of spirituality. All this was inevitable during the pendulum swing in darkness. Now, however, we are moving into the light, and man must shift his attention away from physicality and materialism and start to inhabit his spiritual bodies. It is time for man to pack his bags and move his house of darkness into his house of light, which is awaiting him, the door wide open and the light flooding out to welcome him. In the next chapter, we will discuss how to make this move and what the results should be. So thank you very much for watching and listening to Chapter 6. And for any questions you have about what was spoken about today or the previous chapters or anything in general that you may have a question about, please ask in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. So thank you again, and I'll see you on the next video.
Thank you for watching this video. Please visit our website at thegreatwhitebrotherhood.org. for free books and lessons to help you on your spiritual journey.